Okay. How old were you when you first recall hearing about the war?
I'm gonna say about 10. So that'd be 1970.
How old were you when it ended?
It must have been like 14 or 15.
What school were you going to during the time of the war?
I was living in Oak Park, Illinois. I was going to elementary school and also junior high.
Did you know anybody who was in the war?
Not personally, no.
Did you support the war?
I was only like 10 at the time, so the only thing I could say is that we'd see it on the news. We'd see the fighting on the news.
Did you watch it?
Yeah.
What was your opinion?
It seemed almost like not real, except for my sister Melinda they had prisoner of war missing in action bracelets, and she had the name of a soldier on her bracelet that she wore for years during that time.
Did she know him?
No, but that's what people did to support the war, is they'd wear the prisoner of war MIA bracelets.
Did you go to any protests?
No.
Do you recall your family's viewpoints on the war?
No, I don't remember my parents talking about it. Later, it became kind of a thing that as the soldiers were coming home from the war, people weren't honoring them. There were no parades. There was no. They would change out of their military uniforms as soon as possible because they didn't want anybody to know that they had been in the war, because there was such an anti-war sentiment. So I do remember that, and I remember there being issues related to, drug and alcohol abuse. That there was a lot of soldiers that were having a hard time after Vietnam War with readjusting back into into normal society.
Did you fear that anybody you knew was going to be drafted into the war?
No, I was too young for that.
What about your parents' friends?
No, but I had an aunt who was younger than my folks who was more affected by. She was a teenager in the 60s and participated in the protests. There was certainly an awareness that the young people in the 1960s were really politically active. We were a little younger than that because we were in our teens in the 70s, but there was a sense of the parents were more conservative, but the teenagers were definitely being very verbal and vocal. In the universities, there was a lot of protests. There was a lot of skirmishes with the police, that kind of thing.
Were you vocal about how you felt?
No, I was still in elementary school, so no. I think then we got into high school. We had a sense of it all, and I think that the people my age were just grateful that we didn't have to go to war.
Did they tell you about it in school, about what was going on?
Well, there was a sense at that time that a lot of folks that were against the war were saying, kind of hell no, we won't go, and a lot of people went to Canada rather than get drafted. So there was a lot of people, they called it draft dodgers, where they just left the country rather than participate in the war. So the people who did go kind of, it was a very difficult time because they had risked their lives for our country, but a lot of people in the country didn't believe in the cause. So, there's a lot of antagonism on both sides.
What do you remember seeing on the television when you'd watch?
I just remember there was a lot of battlefield scenes. It was the first time I think the U.S. citizens really saw how gross and ugly war was. I think we had a kind of more abstract notion of what it was. I remember, that there were incidents in the newspaper related to kind of unethical conduct. There was the My Lai massacre, which you can look up. I don't know all the specifics related to that, where innocent women and children were murdered in that incident. And there was, concerns related to, we used a I don't know what you would call it, a defoliant called Agent Orange it was a war in the jungle. And so in order to see the enemy, we had to use these herbicides to kind of, kill the plants. But as it turns out, we exposed our soldiers to these toxic chemicals at the same time. So now, here we are, many years later, 40 years later, 50 years later, and they're dying of cancers that were related to those exposures. So I think the Vietnam veteran came home, just really disillusioned, that they had put their life on the line for their country didn't appreciate it, and that they were exposed to significant health hazards that they weren't adequately prepared for. So it was a really tough war. The World War II veteran, by comparison, came home a hero, and it definitely felt like a war that that we had won, of course. Whereas the Vietnam War was not seen as a war that we could possibly win. So I know that there was also real concerns because they found out that there had been secret documents for many years prior to the actual end of the war that said that our head of our military felt that it was an unwinnable war, but we just kept sending young people into it to get killed. So there was a real distrust that came out of that war. People were real disillusioned with the military.
Do you remember seeing any veterans after the war?
I worked at the VA hospital in the late 70s as working at the VA at the time. In the late 70s, the soldiers the military men that I took care of were mostly World War II veterans, and but you'd see a Vietnam vet out on the street. In the years following, that they'd wear their dog tags and their battle fatigues and stuff like that, but it wasn't like crisp and military like. It was like more child of the 70s kind of a presentation. It was kind of like, I want you to know I was in this war, I want you to know I hate this war. It was a kind of a pushback. But the Vietnam War Memorial, I think, did a lot for having the folks that were in the war feel a great pride. They could go and they could see it in put their hands over the names of their comrades that they lost, and I think that was very helpful for them. But it was the first war where we really started realizing the post-traumatic stress disorder and understanding the emotional toll, the moral injury that comes from being raised one way and having to kill and kill and kill and kill, and worrying every day, all day long, about being killed. Those young men that came back home were really damaged emotionally, and so it helped us, those of us that work in VA healthcare, understand that we had to do more for mental health. We lose now more military men, veterans from suicide than many other health problems, because they're reliving what they experienced in the war.
You still work at the VA now, correct?
Yep, we do.
Do you see a lot of veterans from the Vietnam War?
Yes, now they're aging up into the population that we are seeing in the hospital as older gentlemen and some ladies, and we have to be very careful when we wake them up, to do their vital signs and such, because many of them have significant PTSD, and they'll react very strongly. They're having those nightmares. In their dreams, and then some of them are old enough to have dementia, and the sad truth is that they can still have severe PTSD and also have dementia, and that's a terrible existence. So
it's been 40 years since the war, and it still affects them.
Yep, yeah, it sure does. So the thing that I guess I would want to say in closing is that we should be very grateful that we have brave men and women that are going into the military, and do our best to honor them and being supportive of their sacrifice and their families' sacrifice during times of war. And Memorial Day is coming up, and that's a nice way to remember all those folks that paid the ultimate sacrifice and gave their lives for our country.